It's 1982 and Pac-Man fever has fully swept the globe. The unprecedented success of Namco's Pac-Man and Bally Midway's sequel, Ms. Pac-Man, has left Namco in an interesting spot. Where do they take the series from here? Clearly there's a lot of demand for more Pac-Man games, and Pac-Man Plus wasn't exactly filling that need all by itself. Growing impatient with Namco taking 2 years to develop a true sequel, Bally Midway got to work on their own set of sequels, starting with Baby Pac-Man. Meanwhile, Namco wasn't just resting on their laurels, they were indeed working on a new game. In September of that year, Namco finally released Super Pac-Man. It didn't exactly light the world on fire, however. Super Pac-Man is very different from its predecessors, ditching the Pac-Dots in exchange for different types of food gated behind walls that need to be unlocked with keys. It's an interesting take on the maze gameplay formula, but how does it hold up? Is this an overlooked gem of Pac-Man's arcade days, or just another disappointing sequel? Considering this is Namco's first attempt at a sequel, it should definitely be an interesting case, so let's check it out. As always, I like to start with the intermissions. Thankfully, they actually bothered with them this time, unlike Baby Pac-Man, and there are even 4 unique cutscenes this time. The first one plays after round 2, and sees Pac-Man running away from the ghosts, only to grow large off-screen and shock the ghosts with his massive size as he slides across the screen with no animation. This one's kinda lame. After round 6, we get the second intermission, where a giant Blinky chases Pac-Man across the screen, only to run away in fear of an even bigger Pac-Man. It's amusing, but pretty simple. The third cutscene plays after round 11, showing the ghosts cornering Pac-Man, only for him to disappear and then sneak attack them from above as a giant. I love Clyde's expression and the flattened ghost sprites, this one's my favorite. Finally, after round 16, the giant Pac-Man seems to have met his match with an army of ghosts on his tail, but he comes back with just as big of an army to hunt down the ghosts together. This one's also pretty cool. These intermissions seem to take after the original game's approach, being more comedic and slapstick rather than actually trying to tell a story of some kind like Ms. Pac-Man did. While I prefer Ms. Pac-Man's approach, I do like these cutscenes. They're more entertaining than the ones in the original game, even if the first 2 aren't as interesting. The one thing that bugs me about Super's intermissions, though, is that they all reuse the same jingle, and it sounds kinda weird. It uses these very dissonant chords in a rapid, plucky way that sounds a bit grating. I suppose it fits with the comedic nature of these scenes, but it just isn't as pleasant to listen to as the ones in the first 2 games. That said, I do like the rest of the sound design quite a bit. I wouldn't say it's better than that of the original or Ms. Pac-Man, but it's still pretty good. The jingles are just as catchy and bouncy as ever, aside from the awkward sounding intermission music, and the sound effects have that perfect level of crunchiness to them. Compared to Baby Pac-Man, it's night and day. This game doesn't hurt my ears. The sound effect for eating the fruit is reused from the original game's Pac-Dot eating noise, but the new sound effects, like for opening a gate or collecting a key, have a satisfying sound to them. And the quality sound design here pairs nicely with the game's quality sprite work. Indeed, this game is just as pretty looking as its predecessors. The colors are as vibrant as ever, and the sprites are much more detailed. To start, the walls of the maze have taken a cue from Ms. Pac-Man, changing color every few levels. They're also fully colored in this time, rather than just being outlined, which was likely done to avoid confusion with certain gameplay elements, but it looks just fine. The fruits are the biggest change from the previous games, as there are now a whopping 16 of them. You start with the apple, then go to the banana, then a donut, a hamburger, a fried egg, a cob of corn, a shoe, then a piece of cake, a peach, a melon, a cup of coffee, a mushroom, the classic bell, a clover, the Galaxian, and finally a present. After this, it just wraps back around to the apple and starts over. I did say in the last video that it's just not a Pac-Man game without something wacky as one of the fruits, and I do like the present as a fruit, but a clover is a bit of an odd choice. That's nothing compared to the shoe, though. Why the hell is Pac-Man eating shoes? Well, at least the sprite work here is really good, like I said. For an 8-bit arcade game, they pack a decent amount of detail into these little sprites. Some of the fruits are reused from the first 2 games, but the bell actually got a brand new sprite and it looks much better. I'm kinda surprised that the series didn't continue using this look for the bell as a standard moving forward. Future games would keep the original game's look as a basis for their bell sprites. There's also the key returning from the original Pac-Man, but it's not a fruit this time. Instead, it acts as, well, a key, unlocking these thin gates. Additionally, the power pellets are back with an increased size, along with the new super pellets, which are green and change size rather than flashing. Eating one turns you into the titular Super Pac-Man, which is just Pac-Man but bigger. It's kinda lame that he doesn't get any extra detail despite the gigantic sprite allowing for it. Why not give him a cape or even show his eye, like in the game's promo art? Another change you'll notice after picking up the Super Pellet is that the ghosts become squished, which communicates to the player that you can move through them while not eating them the way you would if you had a power pellet. They look really funny, I love it. So far, Super Pac-Man lives up to the standards of its titanic predecessors in terms of presentation, but Let's be honest, this gameplay is a far cry from what made the original Pac-Man so great. I mean, collecting keys to open gates to get fruits, a super pellet that makes you gigantic, it's very different to say the least, but does it hold up on its own merits? Well, that's a difficult question to answer. You see, I can't just use my traditional methods of analyzing the ghost AI and maze design and call it a day there. This game is going to require a more nuanced approach. That said, we'll start with those familiar elements. First up is ghost AI. It's very similar to what we've seen in the original games, though I can't be sure of the specifics as this game is nowhere near as well documented as Pac-Man and Ms. Pac-Man are. The ghosts do seem to move in the same way they did in the original, with only one noticeable change. You'll notice that sometimes the ghosts will stop in place for a brief moment, and as far as I can tell, this actually indicates a mode switch. As usual, the ghosts start in scatter mode, each heading to their designated corner of the maze, and now they're hunting you down in chase mode. Once you realize the purpose of this mechanic, it's actually quite brilliant. Including a visual indicator for mode switching totally alleviates the issues of getting suddenly 180'd on by a mode switch in the original games, as well as somewhat cluing in players who don't know all those specifics of the ghost's AI to what's going on. Observant players will notice the ghosts start chasing them down after this indicator, and can use that information to better plan their route through stages and avoid the ghosts. At least in theory. You see, when we look at the maze design, it kind of contradicts this approach. To analyze that, however, we'll need to look at the new mechanics in more detail. So, you collect keys to open gates, and sometimes you get big and rush through the maze until it wears off. What's the big deal? Well, the gates that each key opens actually changes every few mazes. For example, at first, the key right next to you will open the gate right next to it, which lets you into the area with the super pellet, allowing you to plow through the rest of the maze without much of a care. A couple levels later, however, this key now opens this gate, so you now have to go around to get the super pellet. A few more levels later, this key now opens the gate to this little box in the bottom center of the maze, and you need to grab this key to get to the super pellet. Finally, once you get to the next set of stages, the key to open the way to the super pellet is all the way up here in the top corner of the maze, so you can't really rely on the super pellet for a free ride through the stage. You wouldn't be able to anyway, since each level you clear decreases the time you have to use the super pellets. And this far into the game, it's not very useful anymore, aside from giving you a quick getaway from the ghosts. You can increase the time you have with Super Pac-Man by picking up the power pellets while in super form. They reset the timer, but with less time than you would get by picking up the super pellet normally. And this goes double for later stages where those timers are further decreased. Eventually, you can't really even do much with the super pellets at all, and have to rely on your raw ghost dodging skills to keep your run going. And so, we finally circle back around to the maze design. Unfortunately, the maze design on display in Super Pac-Man simply does not facilitate your raw ghost dodging skills. I can't really use my typical color-coded graphics to explain the maze design in a simple way here, since the layout is actually constantly changing. See, as you open gates, more pathways are open. Sometimes they'll lead to dead ends, and sometimes not. But even with most of the gates open, there's always going to be somewhere for you to get stuck. Huge parts of this maze are taken up with long corridors with no way out, and even if a gate is open to give you another path through, they mostly lead to more long corridors for you to get cornered in. Even the tunnels can be useless when you go in one end, but can't come out the other because you haven't opened its gate yet. The maze design is Super Pac-Man's biggest weakness, as it doesn't properly facilitate the player's evasive abilities and creates a rather awkward difficulty curve. The game starts out really easy, and you'll plow through the first 10 or so stages with ease. But then the super pellet's effectiveness decreases to the point where you have to rely on collecting keys and dodging ghosts in your normal form, and the maze design is too narrow to allow for that. As a result, you get walled and will probably lose all of your lives in the span of 1 or 2 levels. Super Pac-Man's difficulty curve is just not well balanced. It doesn't have the simple elegance of Pac-Man's difficulty curve, or the variety of Ms. Pac-Man's multiple unique mazes. It just changes which keys open which gates, and decreases your super and power pellet timers. Once you get good at the game, all of your attempts start to look the same, which can make it kind of boring and repetitive. Fortunately, the game's titular mechanic is its saving grace. The Super Pellet turns you into Super Pac-Man, and while in this form, you can tear through locked gates without needing their respective keys, and even enter into the Ghost's cage, which is pretty cool. You can also hold down the button to run. You're basically going to be holding down this button the entire time, and learning to master the strict timing of turning every corner at max speed to get the most use out of the Super Pellets, chaining them together with the Power Pellets for full, clean runs through each maze, at least in the early game where it has the most effectiveness. This is the most fun and satisfying part of Super Pac-Man, and the devs clearly understood that, seeing as the bonus stages have you run through a full maze in an unlimited super form with a point bonus given out based on how fast you can complete the maze. It's really satisfying to perfect the bonus stages, blasting through the maze at an insanely fast pace. It reminds me a lot of using the Pac Booster in the 16-bit versions of Miss Pac-Man. I remarked in that video just how much more fun the game is when you can run through mazes at lightning speeds, and it's no different here. Unfortunately, the awkward difficulty curve makes it impossible to keep up this perfect Super Pac-Man play forever, even if you've mastered your timing. Eventually, the Super Pellet just won't last long enough to combo through the entire stage, and so you're left to your own devices as plain old Pac-Man in a very unforgiving environment. From this point on, your runs won't last very long. I have to interrupt myself here, as after writing this script, I made a pretty massive discovery. For the research and footage gathering of this review, I emulated the Bally Midway US localization, thinking it would only affect some text in the splash screen, if anything. After playing the recently released Pac-Man Museum Plus, however, I noticed the game was significantly faster when using the Super Pellet than I remembered. At first, I boiled down my less optimal gameplay to input lag, but after downloading a Japanese ROM and double-checking the game speed of both versions back-to-back in MAME, I discovered that the game was indeed slowed down for the American release. I really cannot overstate just how massive of a difference this change in speed makes. Honestly, this change was definitely a good one, as playing the Japanese version at the original intended speed is a chaotic mess. The game is just too fast, and quick turns while boosting become nearly impossible. Of course, you can simply choose not to use the dash the entire time, and that may add some strategy to the gameplay, but it simply doesn't feel as good to play as it does on the US version, where you can hold down the button the entire time and still be going fast, but not too fast. As I said, the Japanese version is the one included in Pac-Man Museum Plus, so just be aware of the massive difference in speed compared to what you've been seeing throughout this entire review. The only other thing I haven't mentioned is this roulette thing in the center of the maze. After eating a certain number of the maze's fruits, this roulette starts spinning, and when you eat the star in the middle, you get a point bonus based on what fruits are in these boxes. It seems kind of random what points you get. Sometimes it gives me 200, other times 400, but if you match the two fruits, you'll always get a massive 5,000 point bonus. You could route this into a perfect run of each stage with the right timing, and I got close to fitting it into the first couple stages, but couldn't quite make it in time. It's an interesting mechanic, but I personally find it more distracting than anything else, especially with that grating noise it makes. It can get kind of annoying. I think the best way I can describe Super Pac-Man is, it's fun while it lasts. The blinding speed and satisfying feeling of blazing through mazes in the early game is one of the most exhilarating experiences the series offers, but it's ultimately short-lived. Eventually, that won't work anymore, and you don't really have the tools to keep your run going without the power of the Super Pellet, thanks to the game's narrow, restrictive maze design. There are lots of cool ideas in Super Pac-Man, and personally, I still really like this game. The fun factor here is something I can really appreciate. But after giving the game a more critical look, I understand now why some people don't like this game all that much. Its awkward difficulty curve makes for a game that can get repetitive and boring once you've gotten past the fun part. Like I said, fun while it lasts. That wraps it up for this video. I know it was a bit shorter than usual, but this was kind of a weird one to analyze. We're about halfway through the Arcade Pac-Man Marathon now, and next up is Pac and Pal, or Pac-Man and Chomp Chomp as it's known in some territories. If you enjoyed the video, be sure to like and subscribe, and if you want to support me directly, you can check out my Patreon page. Link in the description. Thanks for watching.